Hey, my name is Cormac Vale. I'm 34 years old, and I build cabinets and furniture in a workshop behind my house, on the edge of a small town in coastal Maine, where the fog comes in off the water most mornings and burns off by noon if you're lucky. I work with my hands, always have. There's a kind of honesty in wood that I never found in people. It tells you the truth about itself the moment you put a blade to it, and it holds whatever shape you're patient enough to give it. I make kitchen cabinets for people building their dream houses, and tables that'll outlast the people who eat at them, and now and then a coffin. Because in a town this small, the cabinet maker is also the man you call when somebody dies and the family wants something better than what the funeral home sells. That's actually how I met her. Through a coffin. I live alone. Have for a long time. There was a woman once, years back, who decided a man who worked with his hands in a fog-bound town wasn't the life she wanted, and she wasn't wrong to want more. I just never replaced what she took when she left, which was the part of me that believed in wanting things. So I kept to the workshop. I built beautiful things for other people's lives, and didn't think too hard about the smallness of my own. A man can do that for years. I'd done it for almost 10. It was a grey October when old Lacey Hartwell died, and his granddaughter called me to build the casket. I knew the Hartwells the way everyone in town knew them from a distance, and as money. Old Alaric had owned half the working waterfront, the boatyard and the cannery and the cold storage, and he'd been a hard, fair, lonely man for the 30 years since his wife passed. His family circled him the way families circle money, attentively, at a distance, with one eye always on the will. Everyone in town knew the Hartwell relatives were waiting. Everyone knew there'd be a fight when the old man went. The granddaughter who called me was named Lacey Hartwell, and she was the only one of the lot who'd actually stayed, while the cousins and uncles had scattered 2 cities and waited for the inheritance from afar. Lacey had moved back when Alaric got sick and spent 3 years taking care of him, driving him to the doctor, fighting with his nurses, sitting with him through the long, bad nights. She wasn't doing it for the money. You could tell. She was doing it because somebody had to, and she was the only one who showed up. The town knew that too. She came to the workshop to talk about the casket, and we ended up talking for 2 hours about her grandfather, about the cannery, about the kind of wood he'd have wanted, which turned out to be the plain, honest oak he'd built his docks from rather than anything fancy. She was tired in the bone-deep way of someone who's been the only one carrying a thing for 3 years, and there was something steady underneath the tiredness that I liked immediately. The same steadiness I looked for in a board before I cut it, the grain that tells you it'll hold. I built old Alaric a good casket. I went to the funeral, the way you do in a small town, and I figured that was the end of it. Then, a week after we put the old man in the ground, Lacey Hartwell came back to my workshop with a proposition so strange I made her say it twice. "I need to hire you," she said, "but not for furniture." "For what?" Then, she took a breath, like a person about to step off something. "The will gets read in 3 weeks, and I've just found out what's in it, or part of it, and it's complicated." My grandfather added a clause near the end. He was old-fashioned and he was worried about me, and he put in a provision that the bulk of the estate, the boatyard, the cannery, the house, passes to me only if I'm married and settled. If I'm single, it gets distributed among all the relatives equally, which means the people who never showed up for him get the same as the person who gave up 3 years of her life. Her jaw tightened. He meant it as care. He wanted to know I'd be looked after, that I wouldn't be alone. He didn't understand he was handing the people who abandoned him a reason to take everything from the one person who didn't. I set down the chisel I'd been holding, and the relatives know about this clause. They found out before I did. Lawyers talk, and now my cousin Pryor and my uncle Sloan and the whole circling lot of them are thrilled because they know I'm not married, and they've spent 3 weeks making sure everyone knows there's no man in my life, building the case that I don't qualify, that the estate should be split, that I'm just a sad single woman who moved home to nurse a dying man for money. Her voice cracked, just once, then steadied. "I have 3 weeks. The clause says married. It doesn't say married long asterisk. So I need." She stopped, looked at me, and I understood where this was going before she could make herself say it. "You need a husband," I said. "By the will reading." "On paper," she said quickly. "Just on paper. A legal marriage, so the clause is satisfied, so the people who left him don't get to profit from leaving. I'll pay you, whatever's fair. And the moment the estate's settled and safe, we annul it. and you never have to think about it again. I know how it sounds. I know it's insane. But you built his casket with the right wood without me even asking. And you're the only person in this town who's looked at me like a human being instead of an heiress to be married or robbed. And I'm out of better ideas, and the will gets read in 3 weeks. She ran out of breath. So, I only need a husband until the will is read. I looked at her for a long moment. There was an easy answer, and the easy answer was no. A paper marriage to settle an inheritance dispute is exactly the kind of complication a man who's spent 10 years keeping his life small and clean has no business taking on. I could have said it. Instead, I heard myself ask the question that changed everything. And after that, she blinked. After what? You said you only need a husband until the will is read. And after that, you annul it, and I never think about it again. I set both hands flat on the workbench. I'm asking what happens after that. To you. You spend 3 years nursing a dying man because you're the only one who showed up. You win the fight to keep what you earned, and then what? You annul the paper husband and go back to being the single woman alone in that big house, while the cousins who left slink off to find their next opportunity. You'll have the estate and nobody to be in it with. That's the part the clause was actually about. Lacey, your grandfather wasn't worried about whether you owned the cannery. He was worried about whether you'd be alone. I held her eyes. So I'll ask it again, and I'm not asking about the paperwork. After the will is read, then what? She stared at me like I'd reached past the problem she'd brought and put my hand on the one underneath it. I don't know, she said quietly. Nobody's ever asked me that. Everyone's asking whether I'll be married in time. You're the first person who asked what happens to me after. Then maybe start there, I said. I'll marry you on paper, Lacey. I'll stand up at that will reading and satisfy your grandfather's clause and watch the people who abandoned him get nothing, and I'll do it for free, because I built that man a casket, and I'd like to finish the job by making sure the right person keeps what he left. I paused. But I'm not going to pretend the "and after that" isn't a real question, because I've spent 10 years in a workshop being the man who builds beautiful things for everyone else's life and doesn't have much of his own. And a woman who'd give up 3 years for a grandfather most people only circled for his money is exactly the kind of person a man might want an after that with. So let's satisfy the clause, and then let's actually answer the question instead of annulling it. We were married 11 days later, quietly, at the town office, with the harbor fog still burning off outside the windows. I won't pretend the 3 weeks before the reading were simple, because the Hartwell relatives did not take the news well. Word got out fast, it always does, that Lacey had married the town cabinetmaker, and Pryor and Uncle Sloan, and the circling lot of them went straight from thrilled to furious. They smelled exactly what it looked like, a convenient marriage to satisfy the clause and cut them out, and they decided to fight it. They hired a lawyer to argue the marriage was a sham, entered into solely to defeat the will's intent, fraudulent void. They dug into my life and Lacey's, looking for proof we'd never so much as had dinner before the casket. They told anyone who'd listen that the heiress had bought a husband off a workbench to steal an estate from her own family, and it was an ugly story, and the ugly part was that the surface facts fit it. A fast marriage, a town cabinetmaker, an inheritance worth a great deal. It came to a head at the will reading itself, which the relatives had turned, through their lawyer, into something closer to a hearing, with everyone packed into the lawyer's office and the air thick enough to cut. Pryor's lawyer was ready to challenge the marriage the moment the clause came up, to argue it was a fraud that shouldn't count. But 2 things happened that they didn't expect. The first was Lacey. When Pryor's lawyer stood and called the marriage a sham, a transaction, a woman buying a husband to rob her own blood, Lacey didn't shrink. She stood up in that crowded office and looked at the cousins and the uncle who'd circled her dying grandfather for 3 years without once lifting a hand to help. "You want to call my marriage a sham?" she said, her voice steady and carrying. "Fine. Let's talk about what's real and what's a sham in this family. For 3 years, my grandfather was dying, and not one of you came. Not for a holiday, not for a hospital stay, not for the bad nights when he didn't know where he was and called out for people who never came. I was there, every single day. I bathed him and fought his doctors and held his hand at 4 in the morning. And you," she swept the room, "you waited. You waited at a distance for him to die so you could collect. That's the sham. The sham is a family that abandons a man for 3 years and then shows up the day his will is read to call the one person who loved him a thief. She didn't raise her voice past where it needed to be. Yes, I got married fast. I got married to a good man who built my grandfather's casket out of the right wood without being asked, because that's the kind of man he is. And if you want to argue that a fast marriage to a decent man is more of a sham than 3 years of waiting for someone to die, go ahead. Make that argument out loud, in front of everyone, and let's see how it sounds. The room was silent. And then the lawyer, old Alaric's lawyer, not the relatives, cleared his throat and said the second thing they didn't expect. Before anyone challenges anything, he said, I'm obligated to read the full provision. Mr. Hartwell anticipated this dispute. He added a second clause. He found the page. It reads, *, I'm not a fool. I know my family has waited for me to die, and I know my granddaughter Lacey has not. The marriage condition is not a test of whether she can produce a husband in time. It is my hope that the years she spent caring for me, when no one else would, have earned her a life with someone who values her. If she marries, whether for love, or even out of necessity to keep what she has earned from those who abandoned me, I trust she has chosen better company than the relatives now reading this. The estate passes to Lacey. The marriage clause is satisfied by any lawful marriage, and to those contesting it, I left you each $1, which is $1 more than you spent on me in my final 3 years. *. You could have heard a pin drop. Old Alaric, it turned out, had seen the whole thing coming from his deathbed, had built the clause not as a trap for Lacey, but as a test for the * relatives *, a way of forcing them to reveal, on the record, that they'd come for money and nothing else. The marriage condition wasn't really about marriage. It was the old man's last piece of carpentry, a thing built to hold exactly the shape it ended up holding. Pryor and Sloan and the circling lot got their $1 each. They contested it anyway, for a while, the way these people do, and got nowhere, because a will that explicitly anticipates and dismisses the contest is a hard thing to break. Eventually, the cost of fighting outran the satisfaction of spite. It always does. And they scattered back to the cities they'd come from, $1 richer and a great deal more exposed than they'd arrived. And Lacey kept the estate, the boatyard, the cannery, the cold storage, the big house on the water, everything she'd earned with 3 years nobody else would give. But that wasn't the part that mattered, and we both knew it, because there was still the question I'd asked in the workshop. *, and after that, *, we'd satisfied the clause. We could have annulled it that week. The estate was safe. The paperwork had done its job. There was no legal reason for a cabinet maker and an heiress to stay married, except somewhere in those 3 weeks of fighting side by side, the strategy sessions at the big kitchen table, the late nights going over documents, the strange intimacy of standing together against a family that wanted to take everything from her, the after that had quietly answered itself. I'd stayed for dinner. Then I'd stayed later. Then I'd started leaving the workshop early because the best part of my day had become the part that happened in that house on the water, with the woman who'd given up 3 years for a dying man. We never did get the annulment drawn up. About a year later, on the dock old Alaric had built out of the same oak I'd used for his casket, with the fog burning off the water the way it does. I asked Lacey to answer the question for good. You asked me once what happens after the will is read, she said, smiling, her eyes bright. I told you nobody had ever asked me that, and now, I know the answer, she said. After the will is read, the cabinet maker doesn't annul anything. He stays. He builds a life in this house with the woman who hired him to be her husband and got something neither of them was looking for. She took my hands. I married you to keep what I'd earned. I'm staying married to you because you're the thing I earned that actually mattered. The cannery was just the part that came with paperwork. We did it properly the next summer, a real wedding, on the dock, with the harbor behind us and the town there, and old Alaric's empty chair at the front, the way you keep a chair for the person who, in a strange way, built the whole thing. In what passed for my vows, I told her the truth, which is the only material I ever really work in. You came to my workshop and asked me to be your husband until the will was read. I said, and I asked you what happens after that, and you said nobody had ever asked you. I think that's the truest thing you ever told me, that you'd spent your whole life being asked what you could do for other people, your grandfather, the family, the estate, and nobody had ever once asked what happens to you. I had to stop a second. So here's my vow, and it's the answer to my own question. After the will is read, I stay. Through every after that there is, I've spent 10 years building beautiful things for other people's lives. I'd like to spend the rest of it building one with you. That's what happens after. That's the only thing I ever wanted to happen after. Lacey, in hers, said, I spent 3 years being the only one who showed up, and I'd made my peace with the idea that the reward for being the one who shows up is that you end up alone in a big house with everything, except anyone to share it with. And then I hired a cabinet maker to be my husband for 3 weeks, and he looked at me across a workbench and asked the one question my whole family never thought to ask. Asterisk, and after that, asterisk, she wiped her eyes. After that, it turns out, is the best part. After that is the part where the woman who was only ever the caretaker finally gets taken care of. I don't want the annulment. I never did. I want the after that. I want you. We kept old Alaric's chair, and the dock, and the oak, and every foggy morning when it burns off the water, I think about a hard, lonely old man who saw the whole thing coming from his deathbed, and built one last clause to make sure the right person kept what he'd worked for, and got, as a kind of accident he might have hoped for, the granddaughter he worried about, an answer to the question he couldn't ask her himself. People ask how he got together. Lacey tells them the truth. I hired him to be my husband until my grandfather's will was read, she says. A paper marriage, 3 weeks, then an annulment, and we'd never have to think about it again. And then she always adds the part that matters. And he set down his chisel and asked me, asterisk, and after that, asterisk, nobody in my whole life had ever asked me what happened to me after I finished taking care of everyone else. He's the only person who ever wanted there to be an after. So I married him for the will, and I stayed for the after. I'd spent 10 years believing a man who works with his hands builds beautiful things for other people's lives, and doesn't get one of his own. That wanting things was a part of me that left when she did, years ago, and didn't come back. A woman who needed a husband until the will was read taught me otherwise. Because the question was never whether I'd marry her for 3 weeks. The question was asterisk, and after that, asterisk, and it turned out. I'd been so busy being the man who builds the after for everyone else that I'd never let myself build one of my own. She gave me the chance to ask the question. The answer was the rest of my life. I asked her asterisk, and after that, asterisk. The after that is everything.